So, thank you everyone for tuning in to yet another episode in which I talk about issues related to public transportation. And I think every couple of months I do this, I go back to what I think people have originally started following me for, which is construction costs. So, that is something that began, for people who don't know, it's something that began with the transit costs project, this one. Which is our database of subway lines across the world and how much they cost to construct. Uh, if you really want, this is the link, but don't be the person who pauses on YouTube to type these things. I, this is how to get it. This is how to get the link. So, uh, transitcost.com/data, view and download our data. This is this file. The only difference between what you'll see and what this is that I have the ability to edit this file and can add things to it and can like vandalize it if I want, but I don't vandalize it. And the rest of you guys will only be able to read, but this is what you could see. I'm coming back to this. I think that the last time I was talking about this was in 2023, but not early 2023. I think it was 6 months ago, and then maybe a year ago. That was the previous time when our report came out. So the cases, some of them came out early, but the complete report, for which the important things, mostly the executive summary, updated it says the 11th of February 23. I think was actually maybe the 6th when this first dropped, and then I think we had some copy edits. Hi Toronto Gaming. And so I bring this up because there are updates. And I don't mean updates that really matter to this database, although there are. So this I added pretty recently. For example, okay, maybe you can't see this. This Kronepoka I added pretty recently. A couple more things there, but some historic lines. I'm pretty sure this is something I added rather recently. The original Stammstrecke. Oh, these are lines that are not. That don't always have information. Okay. I'm seeing why they're like this. I bring this up because there are updates to how we're thinking about this. Some of which go back to the executive summary. And again, I vlogged about this. Vlogged about this 6 months ago, with a different point of view, and I think I said something more recently, maybe this calendar year, because one of the things that we talked about with the database did in fact change for the better, it looks like. And and I'm going to mention what it is, the station size, but that's not what I'm going to talk about because I think there are bigger issues with politics and civil service that that I think are still getting underrated in the English language discourse on all of this. So this is just the executive summary, which I imagine if you're watching this, you either have read or at least skimmed. Again, transitcost.com/cases executive summary. And we have this cube kind of animation where we're starting from the kind of baseline costs. You can explain a factor of about 10 New York premium, which is pretty close to the actual premium over not the lowest cost things in the world, but to lower than average cost things in the world. It's a nice thing where excessive station size is a factor of 2. The stations in New York are either twice as big as they need to be, and also DeepMind, so 3 times as expensive as they need to be, or in the case of 96, they're 3 times as big as they needed to be. So the stations are 3x the size, and that leads to a 2x overall cost because it increases the cost of the stations but not the tunnels between them. Likewise, there are problems with standardization. And so we call this standardization, but really this needs to be thought of as a systems premium. So the way we figure this out is normally, and again this is relative to station size, train size and so on, but for trains that are the size of those of New York, the kind of standard that we've seen in a bunch of different European cases, the standards, and also a little bit China, but only a little bit, we don't have that breakdown there yet, is that cost split about 50-50. Not exactly, but close to it, between stations and tunnels. And in New York for Second Avenue subway, the split was 3-1. So so think of it as the stations cost 3 times as much, and the overall project costs about twice as much. This is where this is coming from. And then similarly, there's a systems premium, so you can slice either the stations or the tunnels into physical infrastructure and systems. So physical infrastructure is digging the goddamn tunnel, and systems stuff like the signaling, the track, HVAC, the finishes. Finishes are sometimes broken out separately from other systems. This is me lumping finishes with systems because that's how the New York contracts are done. In Italy, for example, we have the 3-way distinction for stations, and when it's that way, I don't remember the share of costs that are systems normally. I think it's supposed to be, I don't remember anymore. I think it's supposed to be something like a ratio of like 1-5 between systems and the rest, except that there's such a big New York premium on that. It's like almost 1-1 that on net it's this factor. So the factor for systems is 1. So the same way that the factor for stations is 3 and not 2, but overall it's 2. And the factor for systems is much more than this, but this is the overall, and we attribute it to lack of standardization. And the stations are the stuff that's been attacked. Attacked, I don't mean in the sense of like politically, I mean attacked in the sense of like attacking a problem. That's the stuff that the MTA has started to make positive moves on in Second Avenue Subway Phase 2. This is not cutting the cost in half. There's no way it would be cutting the cost in half. First of all, they only shrank the footprint of the station by half as much as they needed to, and the second thing is more important. They planned the entire thing. They did the entire designs around stations that are too big. So changing it now means that they've already spent all the soft costs. Anyway, so then there's the labor premium, which nobody's touching. This is the overall premium, and then there is the soft cost premium, which is, some of it is just third-party design cost, some of it is procurement problems that affect everything at once. And that's the total. These numbers look very precise. We did that so that the multiplication would match. This is not to be taken as these numbers being very accurate. So even though these are numbers that are stated with 3 significant figures, getting into like 1.25, 1.5 significant figures is probably as good as it can be. So anyway, I bring this up because, again, it's something we wrote in the executive summary that a lot of it comes back to politics and decision making. There's a reason we did this first. This kind of frames everything else, the decision making process. And this is something where I want to say I haven't seen movement, but it's not true that I haven't seen movement there. I haven't seen movement in a lot of things. It's a thing where I think the discourse hasn't moved, if that makes sense. Whereas people do, I think, so the issue of labor is something that everyone outside the political system in, let's say, the northeastern United States understands is a problem. If anything, people overrate how much this is a problem. To be very clear, the labor premium includes things that are not about labor politically. So what do I mean by not about labor politically? There are the labor premium again. It's comparing shares of costs. Base cases, even in Sweden, so very high labor costs. The base case is the labor cost would be about 25% of the hard costs, and in New York it's 50. It varies, but it's about 50. So labor is 3 times as expensive as it should be, and the overall is 1.5x. So the reason I'm saying this is not politically labor is that usually when we think of labor problems politically, we think about things that are caused by high wages, which would be market wages. New York is a very wealthy city. Or by union power, like union demands, which maybe increase wages above market or increase staffing levels above minimum. And the point I'm making is that some of this is costs that are not these political issues, but other things. And again, it's in the executive summary. We give the examples of utility conflict. So we constantly hear from people in, I want to say New York, but really all over the United States, that utilities are a really serious headache for public transportation project construction. The utilities, so in New York, it's often also moralized as well. New York is an old city. You can't map all these old utilities. In London, they actually map them pretty well. In Italian cities, they're mapped pretty well. But I've heard the same thing in, for example, San Jose, which I probably should not pronounce like it's Spanish. Like in San Jose, I've heard the same reason why they don't want to do cut and cover stations for the BART extension. And there's just a lot of conflict between utilities. They don't give one another sufficient information. They don't even collect information well enough. And this is seen in costs along this rubric. So maybe maybe there's a soft cost premium because you need to spend more time on design, but it's also a labor thing. It's also a labor premium because one of the things that happens, and this is something that I know happens in New York, I don't know whether it happens elsewhere in the United States, is that the utilities say, oh, sure, pay for a supervisor from our department or our agency to come into your tunnel and look at it and make sure everything's okay. So this is a white-collar supervisor, so someone who gets paid pretty well, who doesn't need to be doing that job because this should be mapped in the same way that, let's say for accessibility to disabled people, the example that I most like giving is colorblind safe colors. So there's a palette, so I can actually check this, colorblind safe color palette, and this was already autofilled because it's a thing. So with coloring for color blindness, this is the first result. So we can check there. We can check a few others. And what happens is that with all of them, what's going on is that instead of making me, if I'm so I'm not a designer, which means that I don't actually know what these colors are. I sometimes need to ask, but designers know this. It's one of the things that they need to know when they do any kind of design with color. And what they do is they learn these lists. Again, I'm just going to click a link. And what these palettes tell you is which colors will look uh, good even for users who are colorblind. So I'm not colorblind, so to me all of these look okay. But for example, these are supposed to be examples that if you're a designer, you just know some of these palettes, and if you're communicating information with colors, okay, you learned a safe palette, and you just do it through your professional expertise as a designer. It's one of the things you need to know. In the same way, also on the subject of accessibility, if I'm an architect and I'm designing, let's say, a public building, like a commercial building, like a store of some kind, or a restaurant, so something that's under accessibility regulations. I mean, as an architect, I need to know not just the theories of architecture, but government regulations. One of the government regulations is accessibility, so I need to know the accessibility rules where I am. Even things are not accessibility. Even things that are like things like step height. Okay, if I'm designing any kind of vertical change in elevation, I guess all change in elevation is vertical. Any kind of vertical change, like steps. One of the things I need to know professionally as a designer is the regulations on staircases, like things like a minimum tread width, maximum step height, things like that, and design based on that, based on the regulations. And one of these regulations is accessibility. So that would be things like a ramp, like maximum ramp slope. If there's an elevator, the required minimum dimensions of the elevator where I'm doing the design. That's just a regulation. I'm supposed to know this if I'm designing. And now I don't know these regulations myself because that's not what I do. I learned the regulations when I did the Penn Station project. This one. When I did the design for this, I actually checked all the relevant regulations. I don't remember them anymore, but this is compliant. This is intended to be compliant with both American and European rules. Now, this is something that does not require me to pay anyone to check my work for, let's say, colorblind safety, because the palette is already out there. Again, this is a random Googled example, but there are others that, again, professional designers, so not me, are familiar with. And this is the right way to do utilities, is my point. Things that are written and accessible to designers. So this means that there should be a clear mapping of the utilities and some effort made to update them regularly so that the maps are not horribly out of date, which is to some extent always a problem. But you want to reduce the extent of that problem. And then the tunnel designers just know how to work around this because they know where all the lines are. And the American way is it's not happening. Instead, you have to every time pay an office worker, like a white collar supervisor from the agency that you're interacting with. And if there's several agencies, then you're paying several people to do this. And again, these are people who count as labor, they're workers. But I don't even think they're unionized. Then they're certainly not what you think of when you think about union overstaffing. Is there union overstaffing? Yes, there is, but that's not. But I constantly harp on this because sometimes people get into this idea that like all government jobs are fake or something like that, and it's all about that. And no, this is not even all of the labor issues. Political is what let's call it political labor power. Okay, so what you're saying about this is includes the major utility works. That's different. That's betterments, and we're going to get to that in a bit. Because it is a matter of politics and civil service. Namely, the ability to say no to people, which also explains the stations issue. And so, at any rate, the stations are something that there actually is some movement on in New York, and so while I'm saying that morale is improving, the beatings will stop. Standardization, nobody's touching, sadly. And like the understanding of scale is just unfortunately poor. Labor, again, is if anything, people overrate the extent of this. Procurement and soft costs, agency people don't think that there's a problem, but the discourse understands that there is a problem. And then there's the overarching issue of decision making. And this is, and we kind of split the difference in this when we went with the conclusion to the conclusion. So it is here. Recommendations. So, and this is the one that I'm talking about. So, so we talk about a bunch of different slates of recommendations. For example, we talk about project delivery. We talk about design. But we kind of talk about meta issues, so things like import experts from abroad. That's a meta issue. Like the point is not that experts from abroad is like how, let's say, Spain builds things cheaply, or how Turkey builds things cheaply. Turkey did import experts from abroad to Italy in the 90s. At this point, it does things domestically because through the experts, they've learned how to do this well. So import expert is essentially how, if you're not very good at this, you become good at this. But the find champions is something that I kind of want to drill into, because this is something that Eric explained to me and he's right about this, about kind of why things don't work very well in the U.S. civil service. And now I'm gonna cite someone else who was telling me this in a completely different environment about something that is not transit or transportation related at all, but this was about the issue of the vaccines. So you guys may recall, if you're over the age of 3, or maybe if you're watching this many years after the fact, if you were reading the news in 2020, 2021, that there was a pandemic that to some extent is still raging, but the peak of the pandemic was 2020, 2021. And when it began in early 2020, people realized it was a big deal and were racing to get a vaccine, but there were worries that with all the delays and how long it takes to get a vaccine out, it would be years, many years, before a vaccine could be mass manufactured. And instead, mass vaccination was the next year. So very beginning of 2021, there are people who suspect this is going to be a big deal. March 2020 is when it's declared a pandemic. By then, the vaccine developers are already doing this. Like, I believe BioNTech worried that this might be a problem already in January 2020, so they had a little bit of a leg up. They had the vaccine. Technically, they had the vaccine in January 2020, but I mean, it took a long time just to verify that the vaccine was not harmful, the vaccine worked. Like, having the solution is not enough, you need to check the solution. And so I believe they got their first final approval is a little weird. Like, the first place, I forget whether it was the US or the EU, maybe it was the US, that approved the vaccine with all the trials. This was, I want to say November 2020, because remember it was just after the 2020 election. And so it took a little bit less than a year to approve, and then they were already ramping up manufacturing, and mass vaccination happened throughout 2021. By the summer of 2021, in a developed and many a middle-income country, the vaccine was available to any who wanted to get it. This was, again, years faster than believed possible at the beginning of 2020. Why? Well, yeah, they were doing things like accelerating the development. But what do you mean accelerate? Okay, it's not like I can tell scientists, you're not working 40 hours a week. You're from now until we finish this, you're going to work 400 hours a week. Obviously no, because a week is 168, but not 400 hours. But also it is not meaningfully 168 because people need to sleep. It is not meaningfully, let's say you're awake 16 hours a day, let's say 15 is like meal breaks and such. You still don't have 105 valuable work hours a week. This is something that can be done for very short periods of crunch. Uh, it's something that if you're seeing work hours that are that brutal, 80, 90 hours a week, it's something that usually happens as a signal value. Like it's something that is common sometimes in a few work cultures that are not necessarily productive at this. So Japanese and Korean work cultures are infamous for this, and historically it was much more the truth. And today, I think their work hours in Japan are basically American at this point. Maybe a bit worse. In Korea, they're still worse, but getting better. Um, where the brutal working hours are about proving your loyalty to the company. Like that every possible hour that you could give the company, you do, even if in practice you're only as productive as someone giving 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, rather than 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And often these brutal work hours in Japanese and Korean work culture, they also involve mandatory after hour drinks. I think in Korea, I'm not sure if in Japan, I've heard in Korea there's this culture that you must keep up with your manager's drinking. So they have very high levels of alcohol consumption on top of everything. In Singapore, they don't. In Singapore, that's not part of the culture, as I understand it. Singapore has very low drinking rates. Um, but still, like this kind of mandatory socialization is a way of building loyalty among the salarymen to the company. Uh, in American business culture, it's not normal, but in some industries it happens, especially if you're junior. Like early career lawyers are made to do this. Um, I don't know how productive, let's say, an early career corporate law associate is past, let's say, the 50th hour of the week. Yeah, no, yeah, and this is why Japan, by the way, with this kind of culture, has European GDP per capita and American work hours. Like you don't like your first hour of the week that you're working is productive, your 10th is productive, your 30th is productive, your 40th is productive. By the 50th, it starts to decline. Your 80th hour of work a week is not productive. Yeah, okay, maybe it is if the year is 1842 and you're a 13-year-old garment worker in like like Manchester, because then you just keep operating the machines, and yeah, you're going to wear yourself down physically from this, but the boss doesn't care. You're out of the job by the time you're 18. You're doing something else by then. And But for any kind of like modern white collar office work, no, no. Again, there's crunch time. There absolutely is crunch time. Crunch time is not over that long a period of time. It's not like something permanent. It's something that happens just before a release cycle. Um, Again, you can't like squeeze scientists harder. What you can do is make their approvals go faster. Um, it means it's everyone understands that this is urgent, which means that if I'm a regulator and I'm getting an email from the production company, maybe I shouldn't say production company like it's a Hollywood studio, from the vaccine researchers or at the manufacturer, and they're asking me something about the regulations that's unclear, I need to answer it immediately, like same day. Uh, just as a reminder, uh, this is Europe that I'm living in, right? And in Europe, if you send someone a work email in the middle of July, you'll get an out of office response saying that they may be available in a month. Uh, you send that email during work hours in March, the expectation is same day answer. Um, and the So they need to work on this very fast, prioritize this over other things, not do the, oh my, okay, I can sit in this for a week, it's not that important, maybe they will follow up kind of potted plant thinking. Uh, like, so yeah, you're making people do more work, but not in the sense of permanent crunch time, in the sense of making everyone do a little bit more. And that is something that in a first of all, it's easier to do it in a crisis than not in a crisis. Um, but again, this is something that they sustained over a period of a year, so that's not a crunch. It's something that they could set up long term. I don't know to what extent that's led to any changes in how vaccines are approved in the US and EU. I know that there have been people calling for faster approval of variant vaccines because uh, corona mutated, of course, like by 2021, it wasn't even the original wild type. It was the variants started with alpha, then delta, then omicron, where the more people got vaccinated, the more the variants selected for the vaccine escape, which was the omicron issue. And with so to update, so at least based on traditional regulations, every time you update the vaccine for a new variant, it needs to go through a certain process. And I know there have been calls for making that process smoother. So just saying that maybe if it's the same mRNA vaccine and you just tweak the variant that it's working on, maybe you don't need to go through the earlier processes because maybe the safety doesn't change. I don't know enough biotech, to be very clear. I'm basing this on things that I remember having read 2 years ago. But my understanding is that this was the argument. I also don't know if any of that was actually implemented anywhere, either in the US or the EU or the UK, like whatever. And so a lot of it is that like that kind of regulatory reform, like understanding that certain things that that are easier to do in a crisis could be done more generally. And now, to be clear, I said at the beginning of the video that the issue of politics and civil service, I think, gets insufficient attention. Now, in contrast, the issue of regulatory reform gets plenty of attention. I don't know if it gets all the attention that it needs because it is such an important topic that even though, like, you talk to anyone from certain quarters of the American policy sphere and they will talk about regulatory reform. You talk to people who ID as neoliberals and they will talk about regulatory reform. In Europe, people don't generally ID as neoliberals, you just say liberal. And it's a little bit of liberals and a little bit of social democrats who talk about this as in a let's say YIMBY context. But it's something that is it's something that is not at all obscure. People are aware of it. Again, I'm not going to say it is, if anything, overrated. I don't think it is. I'm not going to say it is still underrated. I don't know that it is either. Again, a lot of it is not happening yet, but again, it's something that's understood. And I think the social media expression is the posting to policy pipeline, where posting is often spelled the cutesy way, like this. So people are aware of the issue of regulatory reform. So I want to, again, not throw cold water on this because it is important, but to maybe reinterpret this issue in a language which is, again, politics and decision making. And this is, so remember how I said that I'm basing this on someone who is not in infrastructure or transportation or anything like that told me in a different context about the vaccines. This is someone who, all I'm going to say is that they work as an American government scientist. And what they said, and I'm pretty sure I quoted that on my blog sometime years ago, is that the American civil service way works as follows. The civil service is built not to function. The civil service is built to constantly be told that it is worthless, that the government is a bunch of tyrants, that the most dangerous words in the English language are "I'm from the government, I'm here to help." The guy who said that won landslide elections. Uh, that civil servants are unelected, out of touch with American people, uh, not at all worth anyone's time. That's the mentality. And therefore, they need to constantly be shackled in every way imaginable through endless process. Now, I'm quoting Reagan, so you might think that the view I'm describing is a right-wing view. And sure, in like the Reaganite language it is, but it is not an exclusively right-wing view. I gave the example before of how colorblind safe colors are chosen through like clear rules the designers can then follow, and that is a good example. Or accessibility standards. I again believe that they're a good example of what to do. You have clear rules about again elevator dimensions, ramp angles, things like that, path of travel. And you then let the designers look at them, and like from time to time there's going to be a civil rights office that will look at the final design, and because you're expecting the designers to be normal human professionals rather than a hybrid of baboons and people who get personal pleasure out of creating a hostile environment for wheelchair users and other kind of people with disabilities, then the regulators will need to look over the design to do final checks. They will never find anything that invalidates the entire design. It's always like there might be a little tweak, but that's it. That is the right way to do it, and unfortunately, a lot of, for example, New Left activism. In addition to the New Right activism of the hate for the government, belief that it is tyrannical, the New Left activism is nothing without us is for us. Sorry, nothing about us without us is for us is the line. Very common in spaces for disability activism, and when you govern like that, you create accessibility of New York City Transit is depending on what you say. So they say 23% here, which I think is a low count. Maybe it's old. This says 31% on Wikipedia. Oh, accessible to some extent. So it depends on what you count. I've seen numbers that are high 20s to, I think this is the highest. London is a little bit more than 33%. Berlin is 83.5% accessible. The nothing about us without us for us mentality is the New Left equivalent of when the utilities require public transit agencies or any other street user to pay them to tell them where the lines are. So yeah, instead of give us clear rules about accessibility, it's you must have let's say a disability. I don't want to say DEI because DEI is something that DEI is usually about racism and hiring, but the equivalent of DEI, but for accessibility and for public use for things that should just be engineering standards. And when you run the government that way, you don't have a government, you have lawsuits. And again, you can see the result. I mean, you can see where there's accessibility and where there isn't. And so the mentality that the civil servants are bad people who need to be constantly scolded by some kind of political commissars, that's not an exclusively New Right view. I think it is maybe on net more New Right than New Left, but that's something that is not obvious, and in some cases it could go the other way. And so the important thing is that the American political culture constantly invents new ways to hobble the civil service through, again, more regulations, more hoops it needs to jump through to get anything done. And therefore it gets nothing done. But there are loopholes, and the loopholes are that if a political appointee says do it, then you do it. So if the political appointees are all pulling in the same direction in 2021, they were pulling in the direction of the vaccines, then things can work. And now this can happen with things that are not political, but it's not exactly about politicization. So of course in 2020 in the United States, vaccines were not yet politicized. Donald Trump did not at all campaign against vaccination. He was against non-pharmaceutical interventions with corona, things like social distancing or masks, but he was never anti-vax. Now, his base is maybe more conspiratorial, so over time, since 2021, they've become very anti-vax, and maybe they've pulled him in that direction. I think when Ron DeSantis was trying to run against him, Ron DeSantis was trying to run as the more anti-vax guy. But but Trump, I don't know what Trump does now, but certainly Trump 2020, early 2021 was not anti-vax. So it wasn't like maybe one party's political appointees tried to do X and the political appointees of the other party, which are called the holdovers in American political culture, because the idea that you might have the same person running an agency if they're good at their job is seen as some kind of offense against the public. So then the other party's appointees pull in a different direction. That's not what happened in 2020 with vaccines. But it requires a lot of political buy-in, and this is where we're talking about find champions. So we're saying things like the champions need to advocate for the project. For example, in New York, there's no such thing as partisanship there, by which I mean the Democratic Party wins the election. There might be scares about a Republican possibly winning, but even in, like for example, in the 2022 election, the situation in New York was not favorable to the Democrats, but Hochul still won. And so the party doesn't meaningfully think it is in competition with the other party. It's not like a narrow, safe state where maybe the party keeps winning but keeps having to think about what if it doesn't win. It's a very single-party situation in which politics happens at the level of different factions, different interest groups within the party. So maybe if it's Democrats, the factions could be more moderate and more progressive. If it's Republicans, it's again more moderate versus more conservative. These could be factions. For example, with the Democrats are more multi-racial, religious coalition. So maybe there's going to be coalitional give and take between different representatives of different ethno-religious groups, and maybe also for Democrats it would also be a queer community, LGBTQ representatives. The way American gay rights activism works is that it's really one group of LGBTQ activists. So cis gays, for example, have been, I'm happy to say, good allies in the aggregate to trans and NB people. It's not perfect or anything, but usually the kind of politicians who come from like that milieu, and I'm thinking of Scott Wiener in California, they tend to be very good about this issue. Usually the complaints I've seen about cis gays are maybe like local NIMBYs who happen to be gay, or maybe they're very bourgeois and they associate trans people with some kind of homelessness, or maybe or maybe it's like a gay rights group that is perceived as not having done enough. I know there have been a lot of such criticisms of the Human Rights Campaign. I don't know that space well enough to tell you to have any serious opinion about this. But often these complaints also include they are also weak on trans rights. It's not at all the same as, let's say, Mishfest, where it was a lesbian separatist space. It was also only for cis women. That's not really a thing in the United States. So anyway, it's a queer community, and again, various ethnic civil rights communities, which are mostly in solidarity with one another, but it's sometimes imperfect. In New York, also a large Jewish community that often demands support for Israel, even at levels where nobody really cares about this. So like subnational level, like who cares about what you think about like the conflict? I mean, maybe if it's someone who is going to run for president one day, but I don't think New York City mayors, for example, or New York governors, as of late, have really been like anywhere on the level for that. So again, who cares? And of course, Muslim civil rights groups will demand the opposite. And so it's like that kind of jockeying. So it's again a combination of ideology. Sometimes it's ethno-religious factions. Sometimes it's just one person cares about something personally and push for it. This could be for local reasons, but this could be for random reasons. Like one person is, like really cares about one issue, and they stay in the state ledge long enough to be associated with it. So this is something where there's always someone who's going to veto something. This is, by the way, so I'm kind of doing I don't know what to call it. Maybe not a sandwich, maybe stripes. Maybe like a striped flag, like the main of the like the field of the American flag, or like the EAC flag. What's the flag of? It's the flag of Catalonia, also like that. Yeah, sort of the Catalan flag, where it's alternating stripes. I'm kind of alternating between things about politics and decision making that are very well known in American infrastructure discourse, and things that I think are underrated issues. So the part where I was talking about before, the part where I was talking about permitting, that's very well known. The part where I'm talking right now about veto points, it's called vetocracy. I did not invent that expression. Sometimes in the context of NIMBYism, it has an even more pejorative name, which is the heckler's veto. I did not invent either of these terms. I would not consider myself at all to have innovated in talking about reducing veto points. I mean, I've used the research that other people have done in this, but I don't think that is my contribution to this. Rather, but for example, when we talk about the low prestige of the civil service, this is something that I've been talking about a lot. The civil service in the United States is being treated as beneath contempt. In the United Kingdom, the civil service was traditionally, maybe still is, treated with veneration, but only the topmost people who are generalists, not subject matter professional experts. And the court said years ago in chat, actually I think it was the court, I'm not 100% sure, but someone was talking from a Dutch perspective in chat here a couple years ago, and mentioned that the Netherlands does the same. They like rotating the administrators between departments, on the theory that if they stay in one department for too long, if they're there longer than for much longer than the ministers, then they will accumulate too much unelected power, and that is bad. And then the question is, bad for what? Because it's not, like, I'm not aware of any case in which like fast construction of infrastructure was done against the wish of the public on a fundamental issue. So anyway, a fundamental issue is if the public strongly believes in climate action and construction is done over public objections of something that would meaningfully worsen emissions, let's say a massive new highway system. That is not something that I'm aware of having happened. Highways sometimes get built over local opposition, but there's also extensive support maybe for new highway construction. As I keep saying, in Berlin, the current mayor, Kai Wegner, ran on a platform of more space for cars. Now you could say that maybe the all-left coalition, SPD, the Greens, Die Linke, still had a majority, so maybe the public did not want that. But the public did meaningfully, and massively in fact, increase the vote share for CDU in the election. SPD was torn between going with CDU, which is what they did, which is not what I think they should have done. But the public was aware of who was at the head of Berlin SPD, which is someone who was very moderate, not especially EMB, very hostile to the Greens and to Die Linke. And she's also, Franziska Giffey, very personally, I think, loathsome and unpopular, and SPD lost votes out of it, but they're still the pivotal party. The public let them make the decision. So it's not like it's not like there's like a very clear public support for X and then the government steamrolls that. I mean, there's controversy and it interacts with other issues, but it's not like there's been construction of highways against public wishes. It could be against the wishes of one local place. It could maybe, and I think it does conflict with climate goals, but climate goals are an issue that people vote on. I do want to point out that, again, this is just maybe a German politics aside, but in the new coalition in Berlin, that's something from, that's a 2023 election aspect, and I bring this up because starting in 2023, there became a massive anti-green backlash. And you could maybe say, oh, that was just right-wing media looking for public enemies, which is correct. But, I mean, at the end of the day, like, people choose to read Axel Springer media. And so, I don't think there's some kind of betrayal of the general will. I think the general will is right now wrong. I think there will be a correction over time. The Greens will not stay public enemy number one forever. And maybe it's good to hold off on building too many new autobahns if other things are going to change, but it's not like permitting reform here is going to like destroy Germany or anything like that, and certainly not going to destroy democracy, which is the claim about civil service empowerment is that the civil servants are unelected, but the civil servants do at small scale what electeds ask for at large scale. And if there's a prolonged period in which highway construction happens, and again, this is often very popular, the interstate program in the United States was politically popular. People didn't want an interstate in their backyard, but they were fundamentally okay with highway construction outside a handful of places. Yeah, these handful of places did lead to a certain backlash that did lead, among other things, to funding mass transit. And to changes in how highways were built, but that's not. But that specific thing was not achieved through hobbling the civil servants. Just as a reminder, Robert Moses was not a civil servant. Robert Moses, I keep talking about the low status of civil servants in the United States. Robert Moses was never a civil servant. He was a political operative. In fact, he defined himself against planners. He thought that planners just planned and didn't do anything. Again, it's kind of like holding the professionals in contempt. That's what was done at the time. And if the professionals are held in contempt and nothing moves, then you need the champions. And who is the champion? It has to be a heavyweight. And this is something that sometimes lets things move. For example, we're seeing this with the IBX in New York, the Interborough Express, which is Governor Hochul's baby. But governors don't last forever, and maybe planning takes a long period of time. So maybe what this ends up creating is like I don't think it adds a veto point. I mean, the project without champions just sits there and becomes shelf art. But if you're expecting champions, then maybe you're incentivizing delay tactics, and then the delay tactics, it's very simple. You just hold off until the champion loses interest or loses their job. Um, and the so maybe you're not even trying to win the lawsuit. You're just trying to cause embarrassment and delay for as long as possible. Now, this does not mean the projects never happen. They do, and sometimes the champion can leave but be replaced by a different champion. And the example, again, looking at New York examples that are not even construction, congestion pricing. That was Mike Bloomberg's idea in New York. He got it from Red Can. Now, in British politics, Red Can, I mean, there's a reason people call him Red Can. He's well known to be very left wing. So I'm not very I'm not very fluent in British Jewish politics, so take what I say with a certain grain of salt, the way I am with like American or German Jewish politics. The first of all is that British Jewish politics tilts a little right these days, but for example, the Jewish vote went for Labour in the 20th century. Like, I don't think the Jewish vote even went for Thatcher, and it did go for Tony Blair. And yeah, it shifted right in the 2010s, and maybe it should have shifted back left because of Brexit. The Jewish vote went 2-1 Remain, but Jeremy Corbyn was hostile to the Jewish community of the United Kingdom, and so it didn't happen. And maybe it's going to happen and it's going to happen now with Keir Starmer. I don't know, but for what it's worth, when I'm reading things that non-left wing, so let's say center-right British Jews say from time to time. So obviously they talk about support for Israel, but often that's not the main thing they talk about. And one of the things I've seen in a couple of places is personal support for Boris Johnson. This is also a very London-centric community. Like a large proportion, I don't know how large, but a disproportionately large share of British Jews live in London. So they were familiar with the politics of London mayors, and so they liked Boris, despite his support for Brexit, which again the community broadly opposed. And I haven't seen, maybe I just didn't see the right things, but I haven't seen any positive support for Boris. I don't remember having read people say things like Boris Johnson is good because like his policies as mayor of London were good for our neighborhoods or good for the city broadly. Like, it's not like I'm reading positive things about the Boris bus or anything like that. Rather, it's negativity against Redcan. So people in the British Jewish community, not all of it, but the more center to center right components. And just as a reminder, I don't think Corbyn broke 10% of the Jewish vote in 2019. So like most British Jews are just not left wing, or just not that left wing. And so it was specifically people saying Boris is good for having defeated Redcan. Redcan being the guy who, I think that's why he eventually got kicked out of Labour after many decades. And he had the line that Hitler supported Zionism before World War II. This is what he said. But again, this is something that's internal to British politics, and somehow in American discourse in the 2000s, he was not viewed as especially radical. Left-wing, yeah, but I mean, you could mention him like any other center-left mayor of a city. People would and did talk about him in the same way that they talk about Anne Hidalgo today. Like, I don't remember people gushing about him as much as about Hidalgo. But people would talk about it as, okay, this is like a progressive mayor of a big city. Cities are the future of progressivism, or something like that. It wasn't any more detailed than that, and Hidalgo is not at all extreme. The French left has its own anti-Semitism problem, but it does not come from PS. It comes from the more radical elements, which, fused into NUP, but NUP, I don't know if you pronounce that, but not the normie center-left, socialist / green parties that merged into NUP. Quite to the contrary, leaders from that mentality do march against anti-Semitism, and the voter, and before Macron came in and scrambled everything, so there's like a large body of voters who just center in polls about anti-Semitism in France. They were anti-Semitism levels were highest among far-right voters than far-left voters. Then it was kind of a little bit of a U-curve, but the bottom of the least anti-Semitic voters, and again, this is pre-Macron, so there wasn't much of a center to talk about, were the people voting PS / EELV. So Hidalgo is someone who's much more again normie center left, and maybe I think of her as like too new left, too maybe degrowthy, but normie center left fundamentally. I mean, if I lived in Paris, if I had not moved from Paris to Berlin, I would have voted for her, just because the people running against her were kind of assholes. And so anyway, the idea the congestion pricing idea, which began with a bureaucrat, namely Ralph Smead, this guy, not Ralph Rubin. Why do you think it was Ralph? Anyway, so Reuben Smead came up with this idea, and Singapore did that. London learned it from Singapore entirely at the level of bureaucrats and apolitical consultants, and then it got a champion in Red Khan, and then Bloomberg got the idea from, again, someone whose politics, like, it did, like, I don't know to what extent there's like enough understanding of Livingston's politics in the United States, but certainly someone with like the national leader closest to Red Khan and Labour these days is Corbyn. So, but anyway, there was a kind of London to New York learning. This was picked up by like Bloomberg, who failed to implement it, but he did plant the meme that it should maybe happen. And then it was revived, not under Hochul, actually it was revived under Cuomo. I think Eric and I were talking about this in, forgetting when, it'd be 2018, when he was mentioning to me the various goals of congestion pricing, and the MTA's biggest concern at the time was revenue. Was congestion pricing as a way of generating more revenue for the system. And this is kind of carried over. For example, they charge congestion pricing even at less busy hours. I think it's at lower levels. Your congestion charge, congestion pricing in New York City, proposed tolls. Yeah, so there's a nighttime toll, whereas I believe there isn't one in Singapore or in London. It's still lower, but I think normally, or maybe in Stockholm, it's like 0 after hours. Because again, they're trying to generate revenue and other things. And that has actually continued into Hochul. So this is something where atypically the champion stayed with the project even after the champion was removed. And I think it's partly because there was a lot of technocratic support for it. So this is something where if the technocrats are aligned, you can do. Smead was a technocrat. And in the 2010s, once the idea of congestion pricing came in, the technocrats generally liked it. There was a lot of activist opposition to it from various quarters, which were mostly you didn't ask us. But technocratic-oriented people were in support. Like I don't remember significant opposition from within transit advocacy. I mean, I remember some like maybe people who were dual-hatted as like neighborhood activists were against this, and of course they could sink it over time. But people whose main concern was the subway, and of course in New York there are a lot of such people, and they're not like kingmakers or anything, but they have some importance. Uh, uh, did pretty consistently push it. Uh, I think progressive organizations were at least partly in favor, but I also remember that the progressive organization that was talking to the most in the 2000 was Drum Major. I think maybe it was atypically pro or something. So the point is that sometimes the champion does persist, but it's not common, especially if the project is not something that has universal technocrat support. Now, in the case of New York, if they ever get the construction costs under control, many subway expansion projects will have universal technocrat support. But construction costs have not gone down. And at current costs, Yonah Freemark is a Utica Avenue subway scatter. So in New York, so people who should not have over Germany should have over New York, if I'm talking about heavyweights in politics and civil servants. In New York, for people who don't know, so this is not the best map because it doesn't show recent construction. I guess they show Second Avenue subway hasn't just opened, but they're building Second Avenue subway phase 2, which goes here. Hochul is throwing a trial balloon, and they just funded some planning studies to maybe extend it under 125th. Second Avenue subway phase 2.5 because phase 1 opened, phase 2 is under construction. This is not phase 3 because phase 3 and phase 4 are plans to continue south under Second from where the line currently is, which is 72nd. At this point, it diverges to the west and goes to the west side. So instead, the idea is to continue another reverse branch. Here's phase 3 goes to Houston, and then phase 4 to Lower Manhattan, and they probably won't happen. So there's a trial balloon about 125th at any rate. People keep whispering about maybe building an extension of the subway from Astoria to the airport, but this was an example of what happens when the champion goes, or what happens when champions can mess things up. Airport access is very important to elites. It also is something that's maybe a little bit easier to sell to the general public because a line like across town under 125th or Second Avenue subway is going to be intensively used by people going to and from the neighborhood. So that's a lot of people. The projections in the 2000s were 200,000 people use this section, 100,000 people use this section. I think the projections have been revised upward lately, but this is a pre-corona thing. And Second Avenue subway phase 1, I think, hit 80% of projections when Corona hit. It would have probably hit more than 100% if there had been a Corona, but I mean, if. But anyway, high ridership projections either way. Like even with like Corona ridership reductions, this is very valuable line. But again, this is local. This is people from the Upper East Side going to work elsewhere in the city, or it's people who work on the Upper East Side, perhaps at the Weill Cornell Hospital here, and then they can take a train to 72nd and Second instead of the farther away location at Lex. Likewise, Mount Sinai is, I want to say somewhere here because I never remember which hospital is Mount Sinai. Watch when I check Mount Sinai, and it gives me the believed location of the mountain in like some religious tradition, which is not the original one because the because the Jewish tradition is that the location of the mountain is unknown. So I guess here maybe you would take, it's easier to take the 6 than to take the Q, but from some places the Q works better. So this looks like a hospital. I'm pretty sure I've done this, I'm pretty sure I did it in the previous video and then couldn't remember which one. So for here you would take Q, but the point is that this is for service to or from this area, which is not a lot of people, but they would travel daily. In contrast, this is a lot of people traveling a couple times a year. So the benefits are more diffuse, which you would think means it's going to be harder to find champions. Usually things that have concentrated benefits maybe are easier to lobby for than things that have diffuse benefits, but not in this case, because the champion is still going to be there. It's going to be a coalition of business people and boosters who like airport connections. And then maybe it's easier to lobby for something at the beginning if there's, let's not call it a champion, but a concerted interest group, which interest group could be, in this case, it's a business coalition. It could be a neighborhood coalition for something serving the neighborhood. It could be an ideological, so on, coalition. Like maybe if there's a very left-wing government, maybe they will want to cut police funding, and that's something that, you can get to the proposal stage pretty quick. How are you going to implement it? And they probably are not, because maybe that's not popular with the broad public, or maybe because the cops will not consent, and therefore it's going to be really hard to work with them on having cuts that don't threaten basic crime-fighting functions. It's very common for an agency that faces budget cuts to adversarially, instead of cut the budget where instead of cutting the budget of the most useless programs, they cut the budget of the most visible programs in order to create political backlash. So you need broad public support, and here the broad public support is many people fly a couple times a year. I don't think most of the city, but a larger minority than people who use Second Avenue subway. And this minority, let's face it, like the people who live on the Upper East Side, is wealthier and more politically connected than the average. And so this is something, so people keep talking about this, and then Cuomo had this idea for a backwards airtrain, for which he was the sole champion, nobody else liked it, and the idea died as soon as he was gone. And unfortunately, it was killed rather than modified to be the better extension, which is again direct from the Astoria line, probably around here, going pretty quick to Manhattan, which is the dominant destination for travelers to New York City, and is also, for the most part, a dominant origin for people who fly. As I said, people who fly tend to be wealthier than average. Now, Manhattan is only 20% of city population, and it's not the place for the rich. I mean, yeah, it's much richer than the rest of the city, but plenty of upper middle class New Yorkers live elsewhere. But maybe the kind of middle class that flies a lot is more Manhattan centric, I think, is the issue. Then let's say the kind of middle class that is, let's say, white collar government workers earning low six figures. Maybe they live, let's say stereotypically they live Staten Island, but honestly they could live all over the city. Like the average income for a New York City public school teacher, as of when I last checked, which I think was 2021 or 2022, that was $91K a year. So a teacher who has a lot of experience, like a teacher who's been there 15 years, will earn six figures. It's not that, in New York, it's not like insanely wealthy or anything, but yeah, you can afford to fly. And they could be all over the city, but maybe the sort of person who earns 400K and doesn't think how anyone could ever live on 130K flies many more times. And maybe they're likelier to be living here, or here, or here. So the point is, this is something that is valuable in general, but also happens to be the sort of project that, on top of being good, is overrated, and it hasn't happened because of this reset with the champion system. The champion decided to do other things, namely IBX. So This line is IBX. I mean, currently it's freight lines, but the idea is to turn it into passenger rail, so IBX. So 125th goes down as a trial balloon. This is something that should happen, but has been in abeyance, unfortunately. Current priority for the governor. Then Nostrand from the end of the subway here at Brooklyn College to Tradition Sheepshead Bay, but I keep saying they should also tunnel underwater to Kingsborough Community College. This is a very busy rush hour last mile bus. That's Nostrand, and then Utica. Usually it's viewed as a 4 branch, so start here and then go all the way here. Traditionally, Nostrand and Utica were supposed to be the 2 next things to build after Second Avenue subway. That was the idea in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They've kind of fallen out of fashion. And my point is that even this, something that's a long-standing priority of the rail fans, an area that is not like Manhattan density or anything, but like look at the land use here. I mean, like Utica itself is not great for this, but this is row houses. That's pretty normal. So a couple of bigger apartment buildings. The single family houses that do exist in the area are pretty tightly packed. Like it's normal density for parts of Queens and Brooklyn. There are elsewhere on the subway. But even that does not have unanimous support among transit advocates. Like again, I think it's an important priority. Again, top 4 I think are maybe not top 4, top 5 are IBX, 125th, LaGuardia, Nostrand, Utica. Yona Framework opposes Utica. Yona Framework, again, I don't think he's right with this, but he's generally very good with this analysis. So take this seriously. He thinks that there's not enough density here. So that's not something that's happening without a champion, and the champion's not happening because it takes a while to build. So now, Hikoki. I don't know if you're saying this because of what you said here. So Hikoki, you're using the expression, well, it's not an overpriced bike lane, it also includes major utility works. And why do you need to bundle it with so much utility work? Yeah, it's not. This is not a matter of utility conflict. It can present itself in utility conflict, but the fundamental issue is one that is called in American policy or political language betterments. It's something that could be utility works, but it could be other things like tree planting. It could be for the Green Line extension in Boston before Governor Baker cracked down and removed a lot of useless betterments and also some useful elements. One of the things that the line was supposed to include was a bike lane parallel to the tracks, called the Somerville Community Path. Idea being that you can't just bike on major streets because in America they don't usually let you bike on the sidewalk. They don't set up the sidewalks to be bikeable. And you're not gonna remove lanes from the road from cars to make them into bike lanes. So instead you claw parts of rail rights of way, in order to set bike lanes. And somehow the Somerville Community Path, which was only a couple of kilometers long, was slated to cost $100 million. This is not how much a bike path costs. It's just this was the demand of Somerville, and there wasn't anyone who was going to say no. Like no with like the most grumpy cat expression. I don't know to what extent I can replicate. And so the upshot is that the betterments could be about utilities, but they could be about completely different things. And the civil servants may not want this, but again, these are people who are constantly told that they are worthless human beings in political speeches in the media. and not just in speech but also action. Someone who says that I'm part of an internet subculture and I'm an economist and not a planner or an engineer, hi Jano Lieber, is an asshole in speech, and then I'm seeing his actions, and his actions are to a large extent still asshole-ish, but he did, maybe, I don't know if it was him, but the MTA did start relenting on the issue of station size, the part where the norm is that the station digs are a few percent longer than the platform, a few percent longer than the trains that are supposed to stop there, and instead somehow the norm, I don't want to say New York because it's something that I've seen consultants do also in Canada, for example, it's twice as long. So they cut it from 2x to 1.4-ish x for phase 2 earlier this year, end of last year. And yeah, they're taking credit instead of saying we learned this from the NYU people, but whatever. I mean, like, as I said, I'm seeing morale improve. Therefore, the beatings are going to stop for now. And I contrast this behavior of rhetorical intransigence with not a lot of flexibility, but enough flexibility in action that I'm willing to at least temporarily withhold negative judgment in some cases. The way that civil servants are treated in the American political system includes hostility in word as well as action in several ways. First of all, they are required to, I don't want to say kowtow to political appointees, because the kowtow is like a very specific kind of humiliation. There's like an entire, if you're into like this kind of weird history, what was it? Mansfield. Is that the guy that was the guy? No. Okay, whatever. Let's just Kowtow McCartney. No. Anyway, read about this. This is like literally there was a diplomatic spat between Britain and Borders, if you're watching this. At the time, the country was called Britain. And China over like a specific ritual of submission to the emperor. So I don't mean like that ritual of submission, I mean other rituals of submission. Like people get, like career professionals go silent when a political appointee or staffer to a political appointee is in the room. That's just the expectation. So like norms of like who gets to talk back to who. And also a politician can last minute destroy the work of the professionals. In this case, I'm thinking of how New York City Department of Transportation had this plan for, I never remember if bike lanes or bus lanes, but they had this plan, and Mayor Adams sniped it last minute because some community leaders objected. So this is a case where there is a champion. It's not like there's a million veto points because there was one decider. The decider is Mayor Adams. The decider just humiliated his own his own city, his own municipal civil service, because someone who's like friends with him or something told him to do this. It's that, and yeah. So yeah, you're getting people who are very dedicated to a thankless task, but you're also not getting people who want to be appreciated for their work, and that's a long-term problem with civil service development. And so the vetocracy is real, but sometimes even when there's only one veto point and it's like an almost absolutist leader, like a governor or a mayor, there's no the treatment of the civil servant is so poor that two-bit politicians become de facto petty kings of little hills. And and that's where a lot of this comes from. Like it's like the professionals are not ever empowered to say no about things like betterment, about even about the issue of the stations. The stations are not large because the people who are building them like large spaces and are trying to compete for the Guinness Book of World Records for largest dig, for largest subway station dig. It's because there are lots and lots and lots of little demands and they add up and nobody actually coordinates and nobody actually says, no, there's limited space, please kindly share. That's where a lot of the politics and decision making issue is coming from. All of it is empowerment to say no, and again, in a culture of listening to the professionals, where again, if the professionals are unanimously united, which was kind of the case for congestion pricing, and it generates revenue, which is something the government likes, then eventually it could happen. But maybe the design is going to be compromised somehow. Maybe by a design goal that's about revenue, which is important, but not necessarily to the exclusion of, let's say, street economy. And there's very little permission structure for civil servants to just do things. Again, unless they're yelled instead of yelled at about doing too much, where the political appointees are yelled at about doing too little, which is again the case for vaccine development in 2020. And that's, I think, a big problem with construction laws. It's this disempowerment of the professionals, the disempowerment of the civil service, to the point that you need champions in the first place. Like Newton and Bond did not have champions. There was no specific politician associated with them. To the contrary, the decision to go through them was made by a hostile coalition, by a center-right coalition under Frederick Reinfeldt, who wanted to cut the budget, who was running austerity budgets, but was convinced by the business case, which was difficult. Business case for Newton had negative benefit cost ratio in how it was calculated, which I think was just because it was calculated wrong. But again, you don't need to convince me. You need to convince a very austerity-minded politician, and this actually happened. But it's not like it's his baby or anything. No, it was like normal Swedish civil service planning. And Italy is well known for how powerful its civil service is, just because the ministers never last, and the civil servants do. And so that's kind of my point about politician and politics and decision making. A lot of the problem comes from when you, not necessarily that you don't have champions, although that is an acute problem, but that you get to the point that you need champions, because the champions, they can make big decisions, but if they don't long-term empower the civil servants underneath them, then the civil servants, they will build the project, but they will be able to say no to big things, but not small things, and maybe there are going to be many small requirements that are beneath the notice of the champion, beneath the notice of the absolute monarch. And this is, I don't want to say it's the American problem, but I think it is an important institutional bug in the United States. And again, there are separate institutional bugs that are related in other high-cost countries. So Canada is just Americanizing it. That's one thing. Canada, I know in Ontario the Conservatives are just trying to be like constantly like the Canadian Conservatives for like a generation at least. Try to be American Republicans in a bunch of ways. In the United Kingdom it's different, but again, the elites that are in the civil service are generalists, not specialists. Engineers don't have a lot of prestige in the United Kingdom. Neither do planners, architects. consultants do, but not, let's say, academics studying procurement or anything like that. It's too boring a subject. And then so it's kind of called the American failure and the British failure, which are similar but not entirely the same. The EU is kind of American style in that the EU does not have universal legitimacy and reacts to this by doing nothing, which then further erodes its legitimacy because people perceive the EU as not doing anything for them except doing these dopey EU is you propaganda posters. You are not EU, you are EU. The main, like democracy, diversity, and climate protection. They say while there is a majority in the EU Parliament for parties that are pretty climate denialist to at least some extent at this point, and the majority is going to substantially increase in the coming election. Like the extreme right is going to grow, the center right is going to grow, the Greens I think are going to fall, or the green, or like the left is going to fall in general. Yeah, so most people see this like I mean I don't think most people, but judging by the reactions I'm seeing really like by the parody posters that have a EU poster with Fortress Europe and migrants dying in the Mediterranean, people don't get reminded from this that the EU does things for them. They get reminded the EU doesn't, but pretends it does. And of course the reaction to this perception that the EU doesn't do anything is, oh, we don't have legitimacy, we must work through member states and we can't do anything. Not for nothing, all the good European examples I'm giving of public transportation construction, they're national, they're not EU level. Cross-border rail here is just a disaster, for example. If it's built, it's only high-speed rail for the rich. On Thalys and Eurostar, it's never high-speed rail for everyone, like domestic, ICEs and TGVs. And yeah, so this is the issue of construction costs with decision-making and good things originating in the civil service or in politicians/political appointees, because again, this is like I think the issue of vetocracy is very well understood in American discourse. I don't think much of it has percolated to executive practice, let alone legislations. Like maybe there are some legislative attempts to do some exemptions from environmental reporting requirements, but I don't think the environmental reporting requirements are that big a deal. I think they are a cost increase. I think they are a net negative, but they're not the difference between being able to build and not being able to build. I don't think. Like in the United Kingdom, as I understand it, cost exploded, and then they had and then they had onerous environmental review requirements, like not the same order as in the United States. I mean, or rather, the same order as in New York, or not the same order as in like other parts of some other parts of the United States. And certainly the notion that like you need to have a civil servant that is designed to actually govern in general, not by exception. That's something that certainly the Republican Party hates it because they believe in ending the administrative state, but I haven't seen Democrats defend it. I haven't seen or if they do, it's just because they hate the Republicans. There's no notion that you should empower civil servants more and people who sue the government less. Like there's no notion that the person who sues the government is like a pathological little shit who gets off on being the squeaky wheel because they're privileged enough that they live in a world in which a squeaky wheel gets greased rather than tossed away. And or when there is that understanding, it's still thought of purely as NIMBYism, which is a problem, but it's not the problem. It's a problem, and in a lot of cases, the NIMBYs are, if anything, excused by failed political appointees. But I can repeat myself for why there's failure. Often the problem comes from inside the house, but again, not the professional house. It's something that's either political appointees or civil servants who have just been so used to working as subordinate to political appointees that they kind of behave like butlers, like traditional butlers. The butler is working class. The butler is not the lord, but the butler is so used to and has a place in the power structure under the permission of the lord that maybe the butler politically supports the lord. This is something that the butler in Downton Abbey is an example of this, but the butler character is a very common literary trope from 19th, early 20th century British fiction and modern fiction taking place in that era. There are examples on the fucking Titanic of the butler being loyal to the rich man he's serving to the death. But I mean, in the same way that we can understand the butler to be atypical of the working class, or even atypical of the servants, or not as bought into the system. Maybe they're just doing it for a couple of years to save up money so that they can buy a shack somewhere. And it's the same, I think, with most civil servants are not as bought into the system, and I think that's what needs to be empowered. I'm going to stop here and take questions. And again, I don't know if you're watching Sikoki Cookie, or maybe you are on YouTube. But or others, if you guys have questions, I will take them. I don't intend for this to take long. If this goes past 9, something's gone deeply wrong. I hope for 8:50. And there isn't much of a lag, so just type it in, please. I think I am less echoey now. I don't know how visible it is in the background, but I'm currently no longer in an empty living room. I'm in a living room that has more things in it, so maybe there's less of an echo, but I still have a new internet connection. We'll give it one more minute and then stop. I know people have not been as participatory in chat as before. Your numbers don't seem very different, but if you're typing something very long, just copy paste it and tell me you're typing. If not, we can end just 8:49 and 50 and be done with this. Thanks for the stream. Oh, thanks for watching, Sani. Yeah, thank you all for watching. I don't know if I'm gonna see you Saturday or Tuesday in a week. I've been skipping a couple times. I don't like skipping more than one in a row, so maybe to compensate, I'll do Saturday. I'm not sure, depending if we have a good topic. But anyway, thank you all for watching and bearing with me over what is essentially an extended rant. And I will see you once again in the next one pretty soon. So, ciao ciao.